I was lucky enough to get to take a look at the one that I can confirm that does exist, that makes the most sense.
Everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Communiqué Dart. I am today's host, Gage. Make sure, go follow the Communiqué on Instagram at communique_CU for more episodes, more updates, and everything new style around Chatham University. Today, I'm joined by a special guest. He is undergraduate admissions counselor and self-proclaimed Chatham University historian, Harold Schmidt. Schmidt, thank you for joining me today.
All right. Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here, Gage. I appreciate your invite.
Yeah, I appreciate your time through this. Just hopping on, talking about everything Chatham history related. But just for people that may not know or something like that, can you just give like a brief rundown to kind of like when Chatham started and really why?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I've been working at Chatham now for about 2 years, and one of the things that I think that makes Chatham unique is that it has just such amazing history in such an amazing city. I've always been kind of obsessed with Pittsburgh history because I grew up in this area, and I really like the challenge of looking things up and learning things, and then trying to tie those things together in a meaningful way that makes sense that maybe some other historians haven't done. And Chatham offers those opportunities left and right just because of all the historic buildings around and all the historic people who caused it to be made. So there's a book that was written. I would be able to tell you. I have to do math in my head, which is not my strong point. Doing research is, but it's called Chatham: The First 90 Years. And it is by the Chatham historian at the time, a woman named uh, uh, Dysart was her last name. I can't remember her first name at the top of my head. Started with an L. And so it was a history of it's probably a good inch and a half, 2 inches thick, of what Chatham was at the beginning of its time up through the first 90 years to when she was at Chatham. She wrote it at that 90-year mark. So interestingly enough, Chatham was started, according to her and according to much of the other documentation that I've been able to find, as an answer to another school that was here in the Pittsburgh area. In 1855, the Methodists opened a school in downtown Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh College for Women, or PCW, right? PCW. Does that name sound familiar? We used to be called PCW. Chatham did, right? Because after the Civil War, when the Presbyterians were moving to the East End, they realized that the only place in the local area for them to educate their daughters was at a Methodist school. And, there's history of disagreements between different sects of Protestant religions. The Methodists and the Presbyterians don't agree on everything. And these well-to-do Presbyterians in the East End of Pittsburgh basically came together and said, we're not going to send our daughters to that Methodist school downtown. We're going to create our own school. And so they bought the biggest house that they could find up on the hill, off of Woodland Road, obviously. And that was named Berry Hall. And that was the original schoolhouse / boarding house / dining room. It was just a giant mansion, and it was the entire school. And that was in 1869. They named their school Pennsylvania College for Women to sound more important than Pittsburgh College for Women, and gave the same PCW logo, and then went into direct competition with the Methodist school. And the Methodist school lasted for a couple of years after that. And then in 1889, the Methodist school went out of business. And then since Chatham had already knocked their main competition out of business, and in 1890, they were able to change their name from Pennsylvania College or Pennsylvania Female College. That's my mistake. I apologize. So the school downtown was Pittsburgh Female College. and we were Pennsylvania Female College. And then we made them go out of business, and then we changed it to something a little less formal, which was Pennsylvania College for Women. And so Pittsburgh Female College, which went out of business in 1890, they became a scholarship organization. And the scholarship organization was the Pittsburgh Female College Scholarship Organization. And interestingly enough, it was the president of that organization was a Chatham, well, at the time, Pennsylvania Female College graduate. And she steered much of the funding for that scholarship into what became Chatham College and then Chatham University. So though we were direct competitors when they were out of business, the money that they had left over ended up coming over to Chatham in a meaningful way, with students getting scholarships to come here. So.
Oh, wow. So you mentioned it a little bit about like the historical buildings and all that. If you've ever been on campus, you've ever seen pictures, you know that a lot of the buildings, even to this day, have the historical factor still to them. A lot of those buildings, like, have they been redone like in a major way? And what like historical factors do they carry with them?
Well, I mean, yeah, I would say most of the historical buildings that you find at Chatham have certainly been redone in major ways since their conception. Let's take the admissions building, for example, the new Barry Hall, right? So that house was built in, I believe, the late 19 teens, like 1918, 1919, by a man named Edward S. Bissell, right? And not the vacuum cleaner, like the Bissell vacuum cleaner. But he did own a company that made something for something. And I'm not exactly sure what that is. I could definitely do some more research on it. I have, but I don't have it off the top of my head. But certainly he had a business, and his business did well here in Pittsburgh at that time. And so he had this house built, and then eventually either sold it or left it, his family did, to Chatham University, what at the time Pennsylvania College for Women, and then Chatham College. Now, Barry Hall, the current building that is there, originally built by Bissell, has been used not only as the admissions office, which is its current use, but prior to being the admissions office, it was a dorm. And prior to being a dorm, it was the president's house. And prior to being the president's house, it was, the Bissell residence, I would believe. So those different jobs that the building has means that building has to be refurbished, certainly on the inside, if not on the outside. Like, you look at it now, you've been all through that building as an admissions ambassador, so like, there are no showers in there. You'd have a difficulty making it a dorm today, but not in actuality. The inside of a building can be redone pretty, on a fairly inexpensive level if you just need to do a few things. A couple of those bathrooms could fit a little shower if you needed to, and a couple of those little alcoves could be turned into bathroom rooms with showers. So it could be a dorm again if you wanted it to be, I suppose, and it could be the president's house if needs be, except we have nicer buildings on campus for that purpose nowadays. But that's just one example. I mean, even Mellon Hall, for example, when it was built in the 1880s, it did not have the pool area that's now that was a pool but is now the Mellon boardroom underneath. It didn't have that area in the back with the little cherub, peeing into the pond and the two trees. That was all added by Mellon when he purchased the property I believe it was 1918, and his nephew Edward Mellon was contracted to do the design and hire people to do the building. And from, I believe, 1919 to 1922 was when they put those additions on. Now, we haven't touched it since we bought it, or since we didn't buy it, I'm sorry, since we received it from Paul Mellon who was Andrew Mellon's son. We haven't made any changes to it since then, but Mr. Mellon certainly did make changes to it. Let's see some other buildings on campus that I can think of that have changed many times over the years. So Woodland Hall, for example, was completed in, I believe, 1896. If we hadn't refurbished that dorm multiple times over time, we wouldn't really be able to get any first-year students to come to Chatham because they'd be living in Victorian history, and it would be very difficult. I think probably pretty drafty. You wouldn't have updated bathrooms. I think it'd be pretty neat personally, but that's it would be difficult living, I assume. So yeah, that's been updated and upgraded many times since its inception. And then up on upper campus, the original Berry Hall is completely gone. That building was replaced in the 60s by Braunfels Coolidge. The chapel wasn't there originally at the beginning of Pennsylvania Female College. It wasn't. They began building it in, I believe, 1949 and completed it in 1950, 51 or 52. It might have been even 53, and it's inscribed, I think, 55. So that would be when it was opened. And that was the 50s was when Chatham went through a huge reorganization on the campus, where old buildings were refurbished, new buildings were created, and the school changed its name at that time from Pennsylvania College for Women to Chatham, to signify mostly, I believe, that we were a private school and not a state school, because Pennsylvania College for Women sounds very much like a state school, like it's supported by Pennsylvania. And so I think the Chatham idea was, we're private, we're in Pittsburgh, look at us, and they refurbished the school to make that happen. Now, interestingly enough, Edward Mellon, who was still around, was contracted to do more building on campus. If you want proof that nepotism existed back then, there you go. Edward Mellon, he did the modifications to his uncle's house when they purchased it from the Laughlin family. And then he also built the Welker Music Hall up there. So, wow. He partially designed the University of Pittsburgh, that large area downtown, or down in Oakland, with the Cathedral of Learning. He partially designed that. The designer, or not the designer, but the builder, took a look at his original designs and was like, wow, this isn't ever going to work. So it's pretty interesting that he kept getting work, even though most people just had to keep changing his designs so that buildings wouldn't fall down. But that's a different story, I think, for a different day.
Yeah. So, if ever been in your office in Berry Hall, currently you're very into the maps and mapping out the old version of Chatham, the new version of Chatham. From what you've seen, from what you've gathered, from what you've found, how has it expanded? Did it start out really small and get really big, or was there already a lot of land and they just put buildings on it as time went on?
So, well, I would say it's the whole area has expanded in a lot of different ways. Chatham originally was one building at the top of the hill, basically where Braunfels Coolidge is now, called Berry Hall. And then Lindsay, it's Lindsay House that's that's the English house, correct? Yeah.
Correct.
So Lindsay House was then added as the president's house. And then another building was added called Dilworth Hall, which was right next to the original Berry Hall. And they actually created a walkway that went between the two buildings. So that you could go in between the two buildings. Dilworth had different uses over time. Dilworth Hall was a dorm for a while. Dilworth Hall was actually I believe, a K-8 school for a while, when PCW was a teaching school for young ladies to become teachers. we had our own K through 8 on campus. It was called the Dilworth School. And there is still a Dilworth School. It's a different Dilworth School, but Dilworth was very into education as a major for young ladies, which of course we were a young ladies school. Now those buildings, except for Lindsay Hall, which is just still a house that is now converted to the English department, those buildings are gone up there. But that was the entirety of the original kind of scope of the school. And then Laughlin owned all of the land all the way up to basically where the walkway starts to come down towards current Dilworth Hall, right? So that land wasn't owned by PCW. It was owned by George Laughlin and then by Andrew Mellon. And so all of that land, all along that part of the road, right down basically to Lindsay House, the pond there, and everything where the AFC is, all of that was owned by Laughlin and then Mellon. So that was the largest, single plot of land that we received from a donor that we could use up until obviously we got Eden Hall out in the North Hills. So that significantly increased our campus. And there was where Dilworth is now, there was a greenhouse there. Down where the AFC is now, there were tennis courts. When Paul Mellon left us the house, there was still the pool in the basement of Mellon. And so we were instantly at that time when we received that land, able to add sports. We could have tennis, we could have swimming, we could have synchronized swimming. We had the carriage house to use for whatever purposes we wanted at that time. We had that greenhouse, which is where Dilworth is now, to grow plants or whatever young ladies did at that time. I'm sure it made Chatham completely 100% different at that time. And so I believe that was, I can't remember when it was. I'd have to look in the book again, but I want to say it was, was sometime in the 1940s that occurred, where we received Mellon Hall. So that would have really changed the campus.
Yeah, so you talked about like getting the land for Eden Hall. Why did we get it? And was the original purpose of it to be the sustainable campus that it is today? And for people who don't even know like what it is, what is it?
Oh yeah. Well, this is an interesting it's an interesting tale actually. So that land was originally owned by a man named Sebastian Mueller, right? Oh, excuse me. So Sebastian Mueller was obviously from the sound of his name, he was a German immigrant, and he came to Pittsburgh and he started working hard in this factory where they made different preserved fruits and vegetables, right? So the factory workers, or the factory owner's daughter, right? Well, first he was a really hard worker. So the factory owner was impressed with him and kept giving him raises, right? Second, he wasn't a bad looking man, I guess. You can find pictures of him online. So he and the factory owner's daughter kind of fell in love, and he married her, and then he became, one of the foremen. And this was one of the Heinz daughters. So you can imagine now you're a German immigrant and you're married to a woman whose last name is Heinz and you work at Heinz. I think you probably do pretty well, right?
Yeah, I would say you would do pretty well for yourself.
Yeah. So with his extra newfound funds, he decided to buy this tract of land out in the North Hills of Pittsburgh area where he could go with his family and just escape the hustle and bustle of the hard work of downtown Pittsburgh. Now, you got to remember back in that time, there's smoke billowing out of all these steel mills and, all this it's dirty. Wealthy people wanted to get out of Pittsburgh on the weekends, right? So he buys this land. He has a wife, obviously, a Heinz, with the last name Heinz, and he has I believe, two sons and a daughter. And his daughter is the oldest, and then he has two boys. I think they're a couple of years apart. Well, some kind of influenza strikes at some point, and I believe his two youngest children died of this influenza, right? After he had purchased the property. And then his oldest child, his daughter, also died. And I mean, when you lose, I guess, your whole family, that does something to you psychologically, I would assume. And I assume it did the same thing back then. His wife became kind of reclusive. You don't really hear much about her anymore. My guess is like she became kind of a shut-in at that point, right? But no one really knows. I haven't been able to find any good documentation about it. But what he did was he basically created this. Wasn't even an organization at the beginning. It was this idea that because he wasn't using this land anymore and he didn't want to see it go to waste, and he wanted to see it used for the purpose that he intended it for, which was people to have a relaxing weekend and young people to frolic and play and have a good time. He basically like invited single women who worked for Heinz Corporation to go out to this estate on the weekends to relax. And I think it was all on the up and up. I mean, I sure hope it was. I've never heard anything other than that. But basically, like, it was basically a retreat for young single women who worked for Heinz to come on the weekends. And when he died, he left a significant amount of money. And the idea was the new foundation that he created would still offer women who worked at Heinz the chance to come out for the weekend and enjoy the property. And the foundation lasted for years and years and years. And that's its only intent, was to have this property that people, and it became open for other women as well, not just Heinz women. But it became like kind of a women supporting organization in the North Hills that would, come use this farm to relax, catch your breath, whatever. And then when kind of the Mueller money started to run out, the idea is, what are we going to do with this property now that we don't have this huge endowment anymore? A bunch of different organizations vied for the ability to take over the property, and Chatham as a women's college at the time, and as the place where Rachel Carson got her undergraduate degree, had a big sales point right there, and Esther Barazzoni, who was the president of the school, pitched it to the Mueller Foundation, said basically like, we'll continue your mission, we'll keep this farmland pristine and beautiful, and women will still come out here and use it for its intended purpose. And they loved it, and they gave it to us. And that day that they gave it to us, we went from the smallest college in Pittsburgh by area to the largest college in Pittsburgh by area instantly.
Oh, it's pretty amazing, like how quick something like that can happen. You're given this piece of land, and it's just like, all right, you went from the smallest to the biggest. There we go.
Yep, by area, of course, like, because our student body or anything else didn't change, but yeah, all of a sudden we're giants.
So then, kind of shifting back to like the Shadyside campus here, I know you've done a lot of digging on it and still continue to do research on it, and it's a question that not many people know about it, but the people that do, they have a lot of questions. The underground tunnels that are on the campus here, kind of like, where are they? What were the original purpose of it? Are they still like accessible? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, great question. So some of the there's obviously tales of more than just one tunnel on campus, right? And at the time that these houses were built, late 1800s, early 1900s, you have to understand that things in America were a whole lot different at that time. And so I don't know if you've ever been into Mellon Hall, where you have like the areas that are designed for like having guests and living and so on and so forth, like the beautiful dining room and that beautiful atrium, and the whatever it is, the office or the library or whatever you want to call it. Those all have that beautiful wood paneling. But then when you go through on the left-hand side, through a couple of doors, that wood paneling disappears and all of a sudden it's just white walls, right? Have you ever noticed that about that building before?
I have noticed it, but I never knew like why or what it was.
Well, so because where those walls go from being wood paneled walls to white walls, there would have been a door there. And the servants would have been able to move through the house on that set of stairs behind that door, that white walled staircase. And they would have access all the way up to the third floor, because actually the third floor offices that exist now would have been servants' quarters back in the day. Like they would have lived on the third floor. The full-time servants of the Mellons would have lived on the third floor of Mellon Hall, but they were not to be really seen or heard unless they were needed, and so they had their own passageways to move through the house and only interact with the guests or the people who lived there where they were needed, right? And so the rest of the house was pristine and beautiful all the time, but there's this whole life going on behind closed doors in whole other sections of the house, right? And that also translated to outside of the house. The idea was that the house was kept pristine. Maybe you saw like an old gardener every once in a while doing work or anything, but the idea wasn't that you wanted to see a whole bunch of servant class people wandering around the neighborhood. I don't mean to make it sound like, but you can think about it at that time, right? That wasn't something that people, it wasn't sightly, in their minds was, oh, the servants are going back and forth between the houses. They didn't really want that, right?
Yeah.
And so if families owned multiple houses, or maybe families intermingled or intermarried over time that lived on the road, like Ray House and Laughlin House, the Rays and the Laughlins, daughters and married sons, and sons married daughters, and so on and so forth down the line. So it is. I've heard many a time that there was an accessible tunnel between Ray and Laughlin House at one time. Now, whether that's been completely boarded up or whether there are locked doors that lead somewhere to that, I have not been able to find out in my travels yet. I've heard, obviously, rumors are rumors, right? But I've heard from one individual that they do exist, and I've heard from other individuals that they don't. And but until I actually see something with my own eyes, I can't really be sure, right? So,
yeah.
But it would make sense for these kind of tunnels to exist in those times, because it would have been a way to like, okay, hey, let's go. I mean, it's the same thing we do now. Like, oh, go and ask your neighbor for butter, or like, oh, we're out of milk. Go ask the next door neighbor. Like, but you didn't do that yourself, and you didn't want to send your servant out scurrying to do that either, when you could very easily just go down to your wine cellar and open a door, and there's a tunnel that I mean, like, it's not like you don't own coal mines and steel mills. You have people who can dig these things for you, and so my guess is that passageway did exist at a time, and it probably still does in some kind of way, shape, or form. But it's probably not safe to use, and it wouldn't be a place where we'd want to, open up to students, because that would be a liability nightmare, I would assume.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if students all knew where it was and which door to try to break open, then that would be a liability issue too. And so that's probably why, like, no one's even shown me where that one is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was lucky enough to get to take a look at the one that I can confirm that does exist. That makes the most sense, because like I said, Edward Mellon, he refurbished Mellon Hall when Andrew Mellon purchased it from George Laughlin's family in the late 1918s, 1920s. When he did that, they built that pool. It was the first privately owned in-ground indoor swimming pool in Western Pennsylvania at the time. How do you service an in-ground indoor pool in the 1920s? Like, I mean, you just dug a big hole and you filled it with concrete and you put tile around it. You've got to be able to drain this thing, right? Like,
Mhm.
it has to be like any other in-ground pool where you have access to a drainage system, and the ability to refill it and drain it, for repairs if necessary. So you have to have some kind of access to this space. So I believe that the original tunnel, that I know for a fact exists under Mellon Hall. I believe that original tunnel was built as an access to the swimming pool, so that you could get underneath the swimming pool, you could do maintenance on it, you could drain it. So I believe that it was dug for that purpose, and that Mellon, while it was being dug, said, you know what, the carriage house across the way is mine as well. I would like you to go ahead and extend this to the carriage house and have this come up under the carriage house. And so basically that tunnel goes from the basement of Mellon in the area that would have been servants areas, right? Servants access areas. It goes down, a long hallway. And I believe there's a passageway off to the left that has been blocked off that used to go to where to service the pool. And there's another passageway that continues to go straight, and that goes over to the carriage house. Now, this is still an access area, that's still probably used by maintenance. There's all kinds of piping and like ventilation stuff down there, and cables and power lines and whatnot to go back and forth between the two buildings, that I'm sure require maintenance, and that's why that area is still accessible. But because of all of that piping and all of that wiring and everything else, and because it's just not one of those places that the school wants to have to maintain a presence, and make sure that students aren't going off in and getting lost in, or getting hurt in, then that area is kept blocked as well. I don't believe you can still enter access points to get into it from the carriage house. I believe that's completely boarded up except for where the piping comes through the walls. But obviously you have to find a way to get the piping to that area, so it's open all the way underneath from under Mellon, to where it used to go up into the carriage house.
Yeah.
So,
wow. Oh, wow. So this is something I feel we could make like a mini series. It's just talking about the history of Chatham and everything. But I just want to thank
you. And I mean, like, if we get some people who really find this podcast interesting and they want to ask specific questions, if we know about people's interests ahead of time, I could do like specific research or have the documentation that exists about a specific location, a specific item, readily available. We could even put links in, the bottom of the podcast or whatever to because I don't find these things like they're not just out of thin air. A lot of this stuff is, if you dig deep enough, on different sites on the internet, through, different archive services. The Pittsburgh History Museum has an amazing archive of old photos, of a lot of these buildings, and not necessarily just Chatham ones, but people who were involved in Chatham in those buildings as well. So, certainly if people have interest in something specific and we know about it, please let us know. So the next time we do one of these, we can answer your specific questions.
Yeah, it's definitely something we could dive into if people are interested in it.
Yeah.
For sure. I could see this becoming like a monthly thing too, if people want it. So, people, let us know, whether it be in the Instagram, the YouTube, SoundCloud comments, anything like that. Schmidt, I just want to say thank you for your time. I just want to
my pleasure. Happy to do it.
I want to end this podcast off with something a little bit different. And the question is, what are 3 things that you're grateful for in life?
Well, I would certainly say the thing I'm most grateful for is my family. I enjoy, the time that I spend with them, and I enjoy it. I would say I'm grateful. I feel grateful anyway that I was born in a country that has, like, the basic freedoms that we enjoy. and that I didn't have to be born into some kind of situation that was abjectly not a good situation. I mean, I know we're not perfect, but we have that ability to grow here, and I think that's good. And then third thing, I would say that I'm glad for the ability to to help educate people, because I think education is that way out of abject poverty and everything else. And I think the more knowledge that people have, like knowledge really does set you free. And so the more knowledge you have about things, the better off you are. And I'm glad that I have knowledge about things, and I'm glad I realized that about life, that knowledge sets you free and knowledge is power. And I like passing that on. So.
Yeah, you're full of a lot of
There you go, three
information. So
things.
yeah, you're full of a lot of information. It's definitely something that you definitely can pass on, and you're very good at it as well. Once again, I just want to say
Oh, well,
thank you
thank
for
you.
the time. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for the
All right.
time.
Well, yep. Anytime you want me to tell a story, have me back on. I'm happy to do it.
All righty. Yeah, everybody. Make sure, like I said in the beginning, go follow the Communiqué on Instagram at Communiqué_CU. If you're listening on SoundCloud or Spotify, go check out the video version on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, go check out the audio version, and we'll see everyone later.